This is Dr. Patrick Wilson from Norfolk, Virginia at Old Dominion University. Thanks for listening to the Physical Performance Show. We're going to be talking about my book, The Athlete's Gut, the inside science of digestion, nutrition, and stomach distress, coming your way.
That's the voice of this week's expert edition guest, Associate Professor Patrick Wilson. We've all experienced the horrible feeling of gut upset while training or racing. Nausea, bloating, vomiting, the list goes on. The unexpected stop to the Portaloo. So get ready with your pen and paper for a stack of learnings on this expert edition on how to navigate your athlete gut.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go.
Welcome to episode 345 of the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Polar's stunning new generation running watches, the Polar Pacer and the Polar Pacer Pro, and Say Sky's high-performance running apparel. I'm Brad Beer, sports and exercise physiotherapist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. Of course, we do this across a range of our different episodes: interest editions, coaches' corners, learnings catch-up episodes, featured performers, and expert editions. And on today's episode, we are rewiring assistant professor, registered dietitian, and author Patrick Wilson for an exploration around the athlete's gut. Patrick is the author of The Athlete's Gut, the inside science of digestion, nutrition, and stomach distress, a must-read and must-have resource for all practitioners, athletes, and coaches working in the field of endurance sports. And during today's conversation, Patrick shares around gut anatomy and physiology. He touches on the remarkable trainability of our gut. He discusses in detail common gut issues, the signs, the symptoms, what goes wrong and why, alongside sharing around the influence that our psychology has on the athlete's gut function. Patrick will also share around hydration, fueling, energy availability, hydrogel technology, FODMAPs, and salt and sodium loading. So must listen to expert edition. If it's a revision for you, then enjoy. And if this is your first time hearing Patrick Wilson, get ready with your pen and paper. Patrick Wilson, welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
That's nice to be here. Thanks for the invite, Brad.
Patrick, I first became aware of yourself and your recent publication, The Athlete's Gut, the inside science of digestion, nutrition, and stomach distress, on Twitter. And I was immediately taken by, one, the very cool cover, but second, the fact that something like this, from my 14 years as a professional, as a sports physiotherapist, I just hadn't seen before. So what was the origins of wanting to sit down and write this book? I guess it ties in with your background as an assistant professor of exercise science and a registered dietitian.
You know, it'd be nice if I had like a concise story about how I arrived at this idea to write the book. But I mean, generally, it was just kind of a progression over multiple years where I started devoting more and more of my research time to gastrointestinal issues in athletes. So probably the first study I did that related to GI issues was for my dissertation, where I did a lab study at the University of Minnesota, and it involved runners on a treadmill who basically did two different conditions. One of them was where they got an all-glucose drink, and then another condition where they got a mixture of glucose and fructose, to see whether or not there'd be any differences in metabolism, in performance, but also gastrointestinal symptoms. So that was kind of my first experience with collecting information about gastrointestinal function or symptomology. And from my experience with that, I mean, you could clearly see some athletes struggling to handle the carbohydrate loads that they were getting in terms of their gastrointestinal perceptions. So that was really the first study that I looked at that. And then from there on out, just progressively over the last 6-7 years, I've done more and more on this. So when I decided I wanted to write a book a couple of years ago, I thought, well, maybe I'll do something on sports nutrition because I'm a dietitian and that's where I, teach and spend a lot of my time. But there's already so many sports nutrition books out there that I didn't think I would probably add a whole lot of uniqueness to what's already on bookshelves. So I started to seriously consider, okay, maybe I can kind of devote most of this book to the gut because it's such a common issue for endurance athletes, and even team sport athletes have these issues as well. And I thought at first, well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to get a whole book out of this. And it turned out like, yeah, you can. And in some ways you got to trim back because there's all sorts of stuff you could talk about. So it just kind of was an evolution over the last probably 7 years since I started doing my dissertation to be more and more interested in this aspect of physiology and nutrition. So yeah, it's kind of been just an adventure in a way. And like I said, I decided to write a book a couple years ago because I thought that was the best time to do it. No kids, kind of early in my career where I've got more time in terms of not as much administrative stuff. And that's the direction I went in.
And the book is titled The Athlete's Gut, The Inside Science of Digestion, Nutrition and Stomach Distress, as I mentioned before. A blurb on the back, I think, speaks quite well as to what a reader could expect. And I might just read part of that. When your gut is at 100%, it's a silent powerhouse. But when it struggles, it tells you loud and clear, a dash to the Portaloo, cramps, side stitches, nausea. Every season, thousands of athletes like you endure a long list of problems brought on by a unhappy gastrointestinal tract. The Athlete's Gut, the book, uncovers the triggers to GI issues so you can navigate the complicated world of nutrition and sport and keep your body running like a well-oiled machine. Learn research-backed insights into your digestive system and reasons for your gut distress. And with such a large endurance sports following of this show, Patrick, I think everyone listening in right now is recalling a couple of horror stories or a couple of awkward moments they've had across their endurance sporting career. Yeah. So I think this will really hit a spot.
Yeah, it's the endurance athletes are a group that I think certainly experiences more of this, at least certain types of symptoms. I mean, runners obviously very commonly have these issues. I mean, there's even the term runner's trots that are associated with the specific types of issues that they oftentimes encounter. And the way that I like to think about it is on any given run or any given bike training session or competition, it's unlikely that an athlete is going to experience major issues. But if you add up all those training sessions and competitions over weeks and months, almost every single athlete is going to have some sort of substantial issue over the long period of time. So, sometimes surveys will say, well, it's in this particular race, it wasn't that common. But if you look over periods of months, it's going to have a profound impact for a lot of athletes at some point or another. And that's all it takes is one bad decision or one bad environment, and a race can be pretty much ruined because of gut distress. So, yeah, it's one where I think a lot of athletes have interest around learning more about their gut and how they can do things differently to maybe mitigate some of the problems that are so common with these types of athletes.
And when we say the gut, I think we all intuitively feel like we know what the gut is. However, you write so beautifully that it's a 30-foot long structure responsible for digesting and absorbing the food that we eat or the fuel. Can you take us back to Anatomy 101 and just give a little quick summary of what this 30-foot long structure actually comprises?
Yeah. So there's obviously the tube part that's kind of the lumen, and that's, depending how big you are, might be 25, 30 feet. I don't know what that is in the metric system. My conversions are not up to date. Probably 6 or 7 meters if I had a ballpark in estimation there. But yeah, you start off obviously with the mouth. That's kind of where you do a lot of the mechanical digestion with chewing. But there's also some enzymatic processes that are going on there. You've got some enzymes that are released in the mouth. From there, it goes through the esophagus, which is mostly kind of a transport tube, to the stomach. And the stomach continues to work on the food that you've ingested mechanically, but there's also enzymes or enzymatic processes that are working there. And from the stomach, you go into the small intestine, and the small intestine is really the place where most of the absorption happens. So where most of the nutrients, after they're broken down into these small components, get brought inside your body. And then finally, the last part is the colon, which also does some absorption. It reabsorbs some water that's left over that hadn't been absorbed in the small intestine, some electrolytes. But it's also a spot of fermentation, so especially things like undigested carbohydrate. If they make it to your colon, they're going to get fermented there, which can produce gases and other metabolic byproducts, which can have some positive effects on health, but they can also cause, some gastrointestinal disturbances if too much of it is fermented in that spot. But that's just the two. But then you also think about all the other kind of accessory components, the pancreas, the liver, the nervous system is a big part of it. I mean, when we think about the actual perceptions of problems, a lot of that actually arises in the nervous system in the brain. So you don't want to forget perhaps the mental side or the psychological side of gastrointestinal problems, because it's one of the areas where I've started to do more research the last couple of years, and it's pretty underappreciated, at least in the scientific literature, when it comes to athletes. So, yeah, it's, the gastrointestinal system is the tube plus all these accessory parts that work in coordination to not only digest and absorb the foods you eat, but also to protect your body from things in the environment. You don't want viruses and bacteria and a lot of these things getting inside your body in large numbers. So it's a barrier, but it also has to let the food in. So it's kind of almost like a fortress wall where you have to let the goods in, but protect from the invading horde of bacteria and viruses and other things in the environment that may not be good for your body's function.
And you write that your gut has a seemingly impossible job every day to consume several pounds of food containing an almost incalculable assortment of nutrients, non-nutrient molecules, and microorganisms. And then you go on to say, and I thought this was brilliant, Patrick, the job of your gut is analogous to defending the Great Wall of China from hostile invaders, while also allowing the flow of goods required to sustain an immense dynasty. No easy task.
Yeah, the gut is, a lot of things about the human body are impressive. The gut is one that sometimes gets forgotten about. It's, you don't really notice it until something goes bad or something goes really wrong. Then it's kind of like the plumbing. If it, is going awry in your house, you notice it. But it has so many different functions from, again, not only digesting, absorbing the foods you eat, but defending your body against infection. There's a lot of immune cells housed within the gut. It's sort of a sensory organ. It's kind of perceiving things in the environment and responding accordingly. You've got all these bacteria, particularly in your colon, that are doing things that have implications for your health and function. So it's just a really impressive organ system that sometimes gets underappreciated when you think about, especially athletes. We think about your skeletal muscle, your hearts, your lungs, all those things that we easily equate with performance, but sometimes the gut is a little bit neglected or an afterthought in some cases.
Until, as you say, something goes wrong, which we've all experienced. Patrick, what are some of the gut symptoms that can afflict athletes?
So that's one of the things that I really wanted to convey with the book, is that when people say gut issues or gut distress, it's not all the same thing, obviously. But sometimes these problems get lumped together. But I would say there's probably, 7, 8, 9 common symptoms or issues that athletes might deal with. If you kind of start from the top down, we're usually talking about nausea and vomiting, reflux, regurgitation, heartburn, which tends to affect the esophagus and the upper stomach, fullness and bloating, which can be more of a stomach problem. You've got abdominal cramping, which can be in the upper or lower, but it tends to be more in the lower half of the gut. Side stitching, which many runners and athletes are familiar with that problem. You've got obviously urges to use the loo. You have loose stools. You've got also constipation on the other end, which isn't as common in athletes or runners, but you still sometimes see that among a subset of athletes. Bloody stool or diarrhea. That's kind of a list of 7 or 8 there that are fairly common among athletes. And the interesting thing is that they can have similar causes, or in many cases, the causes can be completely different. So like if you have an athlete who's struggling with bloating or gas or loose stools, the solution to that problem is perhaps going to be different than if they're struggling with nausea and heartburn or reflux. The origins of those problems can be completely different. So you want to kind of track what's going on in the athlete's diet, daily life, to see, okay, are there certain things that are specific to these problems that I can address, as opposed to trying, saying, okay, what's the one thing I can do that fixes everything, which is not likely going to be realistic for most athletes. There isn't going to be one thing that you do that fixes your gut problems. It's going to be probably specific to the issues that you're experiencing.
And by the sounds of that, Patrick, multifactorial.
Yes. That's one thing that consistently, when I've done a number of kind of survey studies with athletes, and you try and correlate whether it be age or experience or training intensity or diet, psychological aspects like stress and anxiety, sleep habits, try and correlate that with gut symptoms. The correlations are always pretty small. Now, some of them are significant, meaning you can kind of say that they're real, but they're usually not, they're rarely ever strong, which kind of says that for any given symptom, there's likely to be multiple things involved. It's not going to be just one factor that determines whether somebody has a problem. And because of that, what I would say is that in most situations, to get a good handle on gut issues, oftentimes you have to take a multi-pronged approach to try to solve them. Now, in some cases it is as simple as like, hey, I just ate a giant burrito before I went and ran, 45 minutes beforehand. That's like, okay, that's an easy fix. But in many cases, it's not going to be that easy. There's going to be a multitude of things you might want to look at, from stress to sleep to your diet, as just starting points.
Patrick, I must ask, with great curiosity, the side stitch, or the exercise-related transient abdominal pain, as people in the field may refer to it as, but what can be some of the common drivers for that? I think most athletes have experienced that, and it's horrible.
Yeah, that's one that is a little bit still mysterious in terms of the scientific origins. I believe the researcher, if I remember right, is Darren Morton. At least his last name, I'm pretty sure, is Morton, who's done a lot of work in that area. And we wrote a review paper a few years ago, kind of going through the potential explanations for that issue. He kind of speculated that the most likely cause is kind of an irritation of this lining inside your abdominal cavity that is causing a lot of those issues, at least is contributing. So in terms of solutions, or in terms of how to deal with that, there are not really like experimental studies for the most part saying if you do this, it'll alleviate the problem. I think partly it's because that issue is a little bit unpredictable. So like if you wanted to design an experiment, okay, how do we deal with side stitch? You'd have to predictably get your subjects to experience side stitch. And that's not going to always be easy, especially in a laboratory setting. So some of the recommendations, though, practically would be to avoid really concentrated hypertonic beverages. So that would be like, a soda or a juice or a pickle juice where it's really dense in carbohydrate. Perhaps working on your breathing, maybe doing slow, deep breathing. Now, this isn't going to be viable for all sports, but wearing some sort of supportive belt around the waist was another recommendation I believe he made. And it's one where honestly there's not a clear solution at this point in terms of the scientific evidence, because like I said, it's hard to actually design an experiment where you predictably induce side stitch and then are able to apply a treatment to figure out how to deal with that. Stretching it out, I guess. I mean, that's kind of what you see. I remember there's a video of Des Linden who was winning I don't remember what year, of the Philadelphia Half Marathon, and she got a side stitch. She's pretty far ahead of the next competitor. She had to stop on the side of the road and just started stretching it out. She stopped for a good 30, 40 seconds while the second place runner was catching up to her, and finally she resumed. I think she still dealt with the issue after that, but somehow she powered through and I think still won the half marathon for that particular year. So, I mean, even elite athletes are experiencing this, and there's not like you do this and it's taken care of. There's not a clear solution at this point. There are some recommendations that may help, but it's kind of a crapshoot to some degree in terms of how we would address that practically speaking.
Yeah, I think most people would accept that to be the case. It is a bit out of the box. One of these gut symptoms, Patrick, that was one of the more humorous parts of the athlete's gut that I must quote here is on flatulence. And you put in a quote from from the physician Charles David Spivak, who in 1905, you say, poetically wrote, "Occasional puffs, buccal or rectal, audible or not, are physiological and therefore useful, though neither ornamental nor always agreeable." I did laugh out loud with that.
Isn't that a beautiful quote? When I came across it, I'm like, I can't believe somebody wrote this. Yeah. This is perfect. There's a benefit to digging into these studies or papers that are, decades old, and you come across, especially some of these older papers, the writing was a little bit different than it is today. It's a little bit more eloquent and sometimes a little bit more colorful. So when I came across it, I'm like, I got to find some way to work this into the book.
Well, I'm pleased you did, because having a laugh, I think, must help retain some of this information. Patrick, let's talk about energy and energy requirements for athletes. It has been a topic we've explored with various experts here on the Physical Performance Show around the importance of energy availability and the consequences on health and performance if that's not there. But can you, from your lens, just share some ideas around how athletes, fueling for athletes, what are the important points that you feel we need to know?
So from the guts perspective, what I'll say is that there are problems from both underfueling, and then I don't want to call it overfueling, but if you're the athlete who is expending 4,000 calories a day and you need to eat a lot of food to maintain energy balance, that is a challenge at times for your gastrointestinal system to kind of handle comfortably. So I'll start with, I guess, the underfueling thing. So there's obviously a growing recognition that low energy availability is contributing in a lot of endurance athletes to metabolic, hormonal, and performance problems if it's sustained for long periods of time. Now, those problems extend to the gut. We used to kind of think of the female athlete triad with bone health, menstrual function, disordered eating, but there's all these other body systems that are involved, and the gut is one of them. And kind of what happens or seems to happen is that things start to slow down in terms of the digestive process, for example, like in the stomach. So if you have somebody who's been eating a low energy diet, who's not feeling adequately, when they do eat something that contains a significant amount of energy, it's kind of going to sit in the stomach like a brick almost, relative to somebody who's accustomed to feeling normally. So this is a bit extrapolated from studies of patients with anorexia, for example. We see that emptying from the stomach is significantly delayed in comparison to somebody who's been eating normally. Now, what's the implication of that? What I would say is if you got like a runner who wants to feel during a marathon, for example, or an ultra race, and they want to be aggressive about their fueling practices, which is becoming pretty common among elite athletes, is to try and push the boundaries a little bit in terms of carbohydrate intake. If your stomach is not emptying quickly, that's not going to be good during a race. Like, you want that carbohydrate, you want that fluid to empty kind of fairly rapidly, so it can be absorbed and then utilized for energy and utilized to maintain your blood volume. So if you have an athlete who is underfueling and they've got these delays in stomach emptying, it can cause symptoms like bloating, fullness, nausea, reflux when they try and fuel during exercise. So that's one easy kind of example of how chronic underfueling may actually contribute to gastrointestinal problems during exercise, particularly when the athlete tries to fuel. Now, the athlete may just say, hey, I'm having these problems, so I'm just not going to fuel during exercise, or I'm going to underfuel because it bothers me. That's still a problem. So, and that's just kind of the upper half of the gut. The bottom half, you also kind of see a slowing of transit through the small intestine and the colon, which for some athletes can translate to things like, pretty significant constipation. That's not necessarily going to be performance harming, but quality of life and just overall health may not be great. So the low energy availability thing is a little bit understudied when it comes to GI symptoms in athletes. We're kind of extrapolating this from non-athletes and clinical experience and anecdotes. But there is cause to be concerned when I think about potential gastrointestinal problems among athletes who are chronically underfueling.
And just to recap, the emptying the stomach can be slowed and transit can be slowed as well. And I think it makes sense that there could be, and there is obviously, effects on the gut from low energy availability. And the issues with the athlete that needs to fuel due to high energy demands, what can they be, Patrick?
Yeah, so the opposite end of the spectrum, you might have, either an ultra runner who's doing huge mileage, or even like during the Tour de France, or other situations where it's just back to back to back, either performance or high training volume. I mean, that's just a lot of energy to consume. So you might have athletes who need to consume over 4,000 calories a day for extended periods of time. Now, sometimes what happens is athletes think, okay, I've been told that these foods are not good for me, they're unhealthy, they're processed, so I don't want to eat any of those. I'm going to stick to a whole food, plant-based diet, which is great. I'm supportive of that. But when you've got, 4,000, 4,500 calories to get down, sometimes you got to compromise some of those things and think, this extra 1,000 calories that I need to eat can come from a more concentrated source because I just need to get this energy in. And sometimes what can happen is an athlete will try and eat all their food from quote-unquote healthy sources, and they'll end up underfueling a bit. Or they'll have gastrointestinal symptoms because they've eaten so much fiber, so much carbohydrate, that they get some bloating, they get some gas, they're excessively full. So those tend to be more of the problems that you'd encounter in an athlete who just needs to eat a really large amount of energy if they're a little bit phobic about using some types of processed foods or energy drinks or more concentrated sources of carbohydrate and energy. It varies a lot from athlete to athlete. Some athletes are really good about meeting their energy needs, and then some, even during high training volume periods, they struggle a little bit, in part maybe because they're a little bit phobic of using certain types of foods or sports supplements or products because they've heard that they're not good for them, that anything that is processed is bad for you, which I agree. You should try and eat a whole food diet when you can, but in some cases you may need to supplement in things just to get the energy in, because meeting your energy demands is going to be really important for maintaining performance and your metabolic function. So it's just something I think those athletes who are training a lot and competing a lot, not that they're doing that now for the most part, but when they go back to doing that with competition, they need to be aware of that.
So the Instagram stories of cakes and bakery treats and drinks for the endurance athlete, the professional triathlete, energy-dense foods is not necessarily a bad thing at all.
I mean, you wouldn't want to do that 365 days a year, but if you're going through periods of time where you've got a really high energy need, then adding in some of those things is going to be an easy way to get in some calories. Now, you should definitely still include vegetables and fruits and whole foods, because there are nutrients in those foods that probably have some link to recovery and performance and how you feel. So I'm definitely advocating that you should eat a healthful diet. Just that when you have an extra 1,000 calorie need on a given day, don't worry so much about having to use some processed foods or some foods that are rich in energy, like desserts or cakes, to get that energy in on those select days when you need it.
Yeah, great. It's practical, it makes sense, and it's liberating as well, Patrick. Carbohydrate ingestion, consumption during exercise. There is a beautiful figure 4.3 to be exact, in the book that outlines the carbohydrates in terms of grams per hour and the exercise duration, and you break it down into less than an hour, 1 to 2 hours, and greater than 2 hours. What do we need to know around the consumption of based on those timeframes?
So the amounts that you would kind of target during exercise are going to vary on a number of factors. One of the obvious ones would be just the duration of the exercise overall. If you're going anything less than 60 minutes, it's doubtful that you really need to ingest much carbohydrate during that activity because it's just not enough of a metabolic demand to warrant much carbohydrate ingestion. I mean, you're not going to run out of carbohydrate stores, glycogen stores, in most cases that quickly. So anything less than an hour, you can kind of go out and do that, whether it be training or competition, and not really have to worry too much about ingesting carbohydrate during the event itself. Now, the maybe 1 to 2 to 2.5 hour to 3 hour range, most studies seem to suggest that intake ranges from maybe 30 to 60 grams per hour are realistic for most people. So, that's looking at a couple of sports gels, be a couple of bananas. Depending on the sports drink, the volume would vary quite a bit. But that's kind of for most athletes out there who are doing anything from like a half marathon to maybe a marathon, team sport athletes. When you ask them what they eat, that's typically kind of the range that they fall in, is like 30 to 45 grams per hour. Some of them are getting close to 60. But most athletes, if you kind of let them to their own natural inclinations, they're going to kind of fall in that 30 to 60 gram range in most studies. Now, the 60 to 90 gram range is based on the idea that if you're going to be really aggressive about carbohydrate intake, that's most of the time only really feasible during longer events, because the intensity of longer events is, on average, lower than something like a half marathon. I mean, a half marathon, elite runner might be going at 90% of their VO2 max, whereas during a 50-mile race, the average percent VO2 max that they're running at might be something like 50, 60% or something like that. So the gut is able to handle more fuel and fluid during these more prolonged events, just because it's kind of a less of a kind of stressor on average in terms of the exercise intensity. Now, there's a lot of individual variation. Some people are not going to necessarily handle that much, but theoretically, that's why those recommendations are a bit higher for the longer events. Now, the key is if you're going to go above 50 or 60 grams an hour, that's when you want to make sure to mix your sugar types. You want to use glucose plus fructose, because those sugars use different transporters in the intestine to be absorbed. So it's kind of like a bridge or a doorway, and the glucose molecule only goes through one type of doorway, and the fructose molecule only goes through another type of doorway, and those doorways can only handle so much per hour. Like if you went above 45 or 50 grams per hour for each of those sugars, the doorway is kind of, it's jammed full. You can't get any more people through or anything more through. So once you get above the 45, 50 gram per hour amount, that's when you want to mix and match, because then you now have kind of two different doorways you can utilize to get that carbohydrate inside your body. So the 90 gram ceiling is based on studies that seem to suggest if you go above 90 grams per hour, you don't really burn much more carbohydrates if you, let's say, consumed 120 grams per hour. So that's kind of why that 60 to 90 gram range exists for the longer events, is because it's easier to tolerate larger amounts. And if you mix glucose and fructose sources, you can better absorb and handle that carbohydrate. Because if the carbohydrate doesn't get absorbed and it sticks around in your gut, that's not going to be good. It pulls out water into the lumen, kind of the tube space. It gets fermented in the colon. That creates gas and bloating, and you can get loose stools and a number of symptoms. So eating too much carbohydrate can be a bad thing. So if you're going to eat a lot of it, you got to think carefully about how you're going to do that. So that's kind of the reason for the range there. Now, there are a couple of studies recently that have fed people up to like 120 grams per hour. That's a pretty crazy feeding rate. That's like, 6 gels an hour, 5 to 6 gels per hour, which is, you have to train specifically to do that, essentially.
And we do want to talk about training the gut. The glucose-fructose combination, is there any sort of rules around or guidelines around the percentage of each of those? How do you know how much fructose goes glucose, or are you relying on pre-made products?
A lot of the sports nutrition companies now include fructose as a sugar. And what you probably want is either like a 50-50 mixture or maybe a little bit more glucose than fructose. So maybe like, 60-40 or, 2/3 glucose, 1/3 fructose. The issue is, at least in the United States, and I think this is probably true elsewhere, is that those individual sugars do not need to be listed on the label in terms of their amount. So it's a little bit of a guessing game. I did publish a study, it's probably 4 or 5 years ago, where I had a bunch of supplements and foods chemically analyzed to look at their glucose to fructose ratio. I could send you the link to that paper. Because sports nutrition products change so frequently, I don't know how accurate all those numbers would be today, because this was done like 5 years ago. But it gives you at least a sense of what foods you could kind of go to if you wanted to get in the range of this glucose to fructose ratio. But yeah, I mean, anywhere from 50-50 to maybe 2/3 to 1/3 glucose to fructose ratio.
Okay, and it'd be great, to pop that paper in the show notes. Patrick, the other thing I think it's important just to highlight there is that carbohydrate ingestion is linked to intensity, exercise intensity. Correct, fellow or former and colleague of yours, expert edition, Trent Stellingworth, did a beautiful job of outlining that if you're running the 2-hour marathon like Eliud Kipchoge, you are going to need a lot more carbohydrate available than if you're running a 4-hour marathon.
Yeah, so intake rates, especially for a back of the pack, middle of the pack runner, you would never need to go 60 to 90 grams per hour of carbohydrate. That's just unnecessary for somebody who's running like a 4-hour marathon. So I try and make that clear in the book and give that caveat. I don't want to give people the impression that those recommendations are just clear cut. You take them as they are. The context is not only the duration and intensity of the exercise, but what is your goal? And what caliber of athlete are you? Are you trying to finish as fast as you possibly can? Are you trying to set a PR? Are you a sub-elite to elite class runner or athlete? Or are you someone who just wants to enjoy the sports and who's looking to finish? If you're the latter category, you don't need to get so crazy about the amounts, dialing in specific ratios. I don't know that it's worth your time to be that rigorous if you're more of the casual recreational type athlete. Not to say that you shouldn't pay attention to some of these things, because it may affect your gut function and how you feel, but you don't need to get overly crazy or aggressive with the carbohydrate load that you're trying to ingest during competition or training.
That's practical and it makes sense. And Patrick, just before we move off carbohydrate consumption during exercise, you do note and reference the hydrogel technology through, I think, a sports drink that everyone's familiar with now since really Eliud Kipchoge's accomplishment with the sub-2-hour marathon, and that is Maurten. This is not a plug for Maurten, but can you just briefly outline what's potentially so special about that hydrogel technology and what is it?
So the hydrogels, definitely becoming popular with athletes. And at the time of the book publication, when it came out, there were maybe 2 or 3 studies that had been published at that point. Now there's 6 or 7 or 8. There's actually just a systematic review published on that topic in the last week. Andy King was the lead author. He's working, I think, with Louise Burke from Australia, and they reviewed the evidence on that. I was a little bit annoyed because I had a student who was going to do that in the fall for one of his independent studies. I'm like, I've got to go back to the drawing board now. But yeah, basically what most of these studies have found is that it doesn't seem to translate to more carbohydrate burning, less GI symptoms, or better performance. Okay, the theory is when you have these alginate-containing supplements. It's kind of a sodium alginate, I believe, is the actual substance. When it gets into the stomach, the acidic environment that's there is going to turn it into what's called a hydrogel. And that hydrogel is going to kind of surround the carbohydrate molecules so that once they get into the small intestine, they're less likely to activate sensory tissue there. So why is that important? The activation of the sensory tissue in your small intestine just outside the stomach regulates gastric emptying or stomach emptying. So if that sensory tissue gets really activated, it's going to say, whoa, 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 slow down. You've got too much carbohydrate being dumped all at once into the small intestine. We don't want that. We kind of want a nice drip, drip, drip. So what the hydrogel theoretically would do is allow for that carbohydrate to more steadily, quickly empty into the small intestine, and thus allow for a more rapid absorption of carbohydrates to be used for fuel. Also, there's some speculation that it would reduce some types of gastrointestinal symptoms. So there's at least some studies that show that, yes, ingesting a hydrogel-based beverage does speed gastric emptying at rest, so when people are sitting around. But the whatever it is, 6 or 7 studies that have looked at this during exercise have not really found much of anything in terms of differences in metabolism or performance or gut symptoms. So for whatever reason, those theoretical benefits are not, at this point, seeming to translate to anything meaningful during exercise. That's not to say that there won't be some studies that eventually come out showing that in this situation it may be applicable. In this type of athlete, it may be applicable, but overall, based on the studies that have been done, it doesn't seem like it's really that extra beneficial. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
You're listening to this expert edition Rewired Patrick Wilson, The Athlete's Gut. Support for today's show comes from Polar. Polar believe that the most important thing you can do is listen to your heart. What Polar does helps to improve the health, fitness, and quality of millions of lives around the world. This is what drives them. But what is driving you? If you are interested in the next step in your fitness and health tracking, do take a moment to check out our friends at polar.com. If you're looking for the latest in running watches, Polar have the all-new Pacer range. For multi-sport, it's the Vantage V2. Or if you're getting off the beaten track and need a premium outdoor GPS watch, look no further than the stunning and tough GridX Pro watches. However, if you want to get the most out of your training and racing, take a beat and grab the gold standard in heart rate monitors, the Polar H10. Or for an even more flexible heart rate monitor, the Verity Sense, which also tracks your heart rate for swimming. Polar's range starts at $129, but what's most important is that whatever you are doing, do it with heart. Visit polar.com. Support for today's show also comes from SaySky. SaySky was established in 2013 in Copenhagen with a mission to create high-performance running wear with an urban and casual attitude. SaySky was founded by CEO and founder Lars Pedersen, a former pro windsurfer who decided to take the relaxed and fun attitude of windsurfing into the running world. This attitude, together with SaySky's focus on high performance and quality, has become SaySky's mission in a time when the market has been dulled by giants in the running apparel industry. SaySky's style is Scandinavian, metropolitan, minimalistic, with a penchant for urban colours. SaySky's vision is clear. It's to progress and elevate the apparel scene of running and to nurse the contemporary generation of athletes who are passionate and serious about their sport, yet with a laid-back mindset. SaySky believe 100% in the everyday heroes, the people who are juggling work, friends and family, but still have the time and dedication to train hard and have fun along the way. This mentality is what SaySky celebrates, and it's something that the SaySky community really get around. The team have generously offered up to 15% off running apparel simply by using the code TPPS, all capitals, 15 numerics, over at saysky.us. For now, let's jump back with Assistant Professor, Registered Dietitian and Author, Patrick Wilson, exploring the athlete's gut.
Patrick, you mentioned FODMAPs in the section on carbohydrates. What are FODMAPs, and should an athlete be worried about it? What do they need to know in brief?
That's an interesting one where I think there's definitely some potential with the low FODMAP diets. And basically FODMAPs are these fermentable short-chain carbohydrates. The whole acronym is fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols, if I got all that right. But basically, it's all these short-chain carbohydrates that in some people are not digested and absorbed particularly efficiently. So as I mentioned earlier on, when you don't digest carbohydrate, it sticks around in your gut. And once it gets to especially the far part of the small intestine and the colon, the bacteria there that are so densely populated start to ferment that carbohydrate and produce things like gas. So you can have loose stools, gas, bloating, if you're consuming a lot of FODMAPs and you're the type of person who doesn't digest those FODMAPs very well. So two easy examples of FODMAPs would be lactose and fructose. So those are sugars that most people are familiar with, that if ingested in large amounts in some people can cause issues. Now there are others beyond that, but especially for athletes, lactose and fructose tend to be two that are consumed in larger amounts in their diet. Now, do low FODMAP diets help with GI symptoms? Most of this is coming from irritable bowel syndrome patients. That's kind of where the low FODMAP approach was developed out of Monash University. There's a lot of evidence in IBS that it seems to be helpful. There's maybe 3 or 4 studies in athletes now, I think primarily runners. Some benefits. There's only really been one that showed during exercise GI symptoms were seemingly lower. And they only had the people do a 24-hour low FODMAP diet. So it's not like they did it for 2 weeks. So I think for some athletes who are consuming a lot of FODMAPs to begin with, there is some potential benefit there for using this periodically before important training sessions or before competition. The concern is doing this all the time, those FODMAPs actually serve as what we call prebiotics. They are fuel for the bacteria in your colon. Some of those bacteria are health promoting. So you don't necessarily want to just eliminate all FODMAPs because it could have detrimental effects on your gastrointestinal health in the long term. But doing it periodically before races or games or competitions or training sessions, you could do it for a day or two and see if it gives you any relief. And this would be primarily people who are eating a lot of FODMAPs. If you're not eating a lot of FODMAPs, then it doesn't make sense to really pay attention to that in the first place.
Yeah, okay. And the link there is noted in particular with IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. Fats and proteins, Patrick, any key takeaways there? You devote quite a few pages to them in the athlete's gut.
It's in terms of during exercise, I think most people are aware that you probably don't want to eat huge amounts. Now, the difference is as you get into ultra endurance stuff and then especially multi-day races, you can more easily tolerate protein and fat. And obviously you'd want to consume significant quantities of protein during those multi-day events to help deal with the muscle damage that you're experiencing. But during single day stuff, during shorter races, you wouldn't generally want to consume a huge amount of protein and fat because they're generally not burned at a high rate during exercise itself. And especially fat tends to kind of slow things down in the upper half of your gut, so it can provoke nausea, vomiting, reflux. So during exercise, carbohydrate is typically the priority unless you're doing like a multi-day sort of endurance thing where you want maybe a more balanced macronutrient intake. Now, habitually in the diet, what effect do they have on gut symptoms? It kind of depends on the sources that you're consuming, how close in proximity to exercise. Just the general takeaways are be careful about the quantity of especially solid proteins and high-fat foods you're eating within the hour or two before doing, especially something intense. If it's a lower intensity training session, you can eat a decent amount of protein and fat and probably not have much of a problem. So it's context specific in terms of timing and amount in relationship to when you're exercising. Okay, and the other thing that I think really just jumped out there is it can hinder performance in events that are higher in intensity, the fat intake. Yeah, it's fat because it's so energy dense. There's 9 kcals per gram. One of the main things that regulates how quickly stuff leaves your stomach is just how much energy is in it. So of any macronutrient, fat tends to be the one that slows down gastric emptying the most. So like if you crush a meal that has a huge amount of fat in it, it kind of can sit in your stomach like a brick for a while. And if you exercise within the next hour or two, that's going to be more likely to cause reflux, heartburn, nausea, potentially vomiting. So timing and amount is what you want to look at.
Patrick, sodium intake. I was really interested to read and learn through reading The Athlete's Gut that sodium supplementation has been shown to elicit few performance-enhancing effects. So that, maybe I've misquoted that or misread that, misinterpreted that, but what do we need to know about sodium? My base understanding is that there's higher salt excretors and maybe lower salt excretors, and a memory I hold on to was in the 2015 New York Marathon. I remember all week they were talking about salt loading. And in Australia, the message was carbohydrate load.
I mean, the statement they made that it's generally not shown to be performance-enhancing is true when we specifically talk about salt ingestion or sodium ingestion during the exercise itself. So, like, when I'm actually out there on the course, do I need to focus on salt ingestion while I'm running or while I'm cycling? And based on the handful of studies that we have, no, it doesn't seem to be particularly important, specifically when we talk about performance. Now, there's not a huge amount of studies on this that have isolated sodium, because usually the sodium is packed into a beverage with carbohydrate, with fluid, with something else. So there's only a handful of studies that have actually just given people like salt tablets to see, okay, what does this do to performance? And the bulk of them have not shown any benefit whatsoever. So what I would say is during the exercise itself, I wouldn't be overly concerned about sodium. That being said, if you're training a lot and you're sweating a lot, you probably are losing a significant amount of sodium in your sweat, multiple grams per day. So yes, certain athletes probably do need to focus on making sure they get enough sodium in their diet. But most people do not have a problem getting enough sodium in their diet, unless you're following a super unprocessed diet. In some cases, it can be a little bit challenging, but I would say most people do not struggle to get enough sodium. So if you are a person who's potentially losing a lot of sodium through sweating, I would say just make sure throughout your day you're getting in, kind of sources or foods that contain a decent amount of sodium throughout the day. And you don't necessarily need to focus on during exercise itself. Because during exercise, at that point, adding in sodium doesn't seem to add a whole lot of benefit. And this is mostly for studies that last up to like 12 hours. Now, beyond that, like ultra stuff, it's kind of an unknown. So it's hard to say exactly what role that plays in performance from a scientific perspective. Now, the last thing, the salt loading thing, there are some studies that do show a benefit from salt loading in hot environments. So this is before exercise. So what salt loading does is allows you to hold on to more fluid. So you're kind of almost like fluid loading and using salt to do it. And there are a couple of studies that have shown benefits. I think Stacy Sims, I don't know if you've had her on, she did a couple of those studies. So that's one exception to the sodium performance things. If you do it beforehand and it helps you hold on to more fluid in a hot environment, theoretically, it may be helpful. Okay,
that would intuitively make sense for sure. Patrick, it ties in with fluid intake. Any golden tips there around fluid intake? Ties in beautifully, I guess, with sodium intake.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
I think I heard you say this was one of the toughest parts to write, if not, is that correct, for the Athlete's Gut?
Yeah. It's just, there's so many variables to consider, when you think about duration, intensity, personal experience with hydration, the environment, the duration. It's just a lot of moving parts. And there's debate among scientists as to whether you need to be really pragmatic or regimented about fluid intake, or if you can just kind of use your body's thirst perception to dictate how much you should drink. And there are differences of opinion even among scientists. So it's one that's hard to come up with easy, simple recommendations that fit every scenario. What I would say is we know that underhydration does lead to gut problems. We also know that overhydration leads to gut problems. So underhydration part, usually that's stemming from if you're losing a lot of body fluid, some of that is coming from your blood volume. And if you have less blood volume to go around, that means your gut is probably getting less of it, because the gut is not really a priority during exercise. And that can trigger some gut issues. If you're underhydrated, the actual loss of fluid volume, especially in your blood, may be contributing to gut problems. Now, on the other end, if you just kind of try and force feed yourself large amounts of fluid to keep up with your sweat rates, that's just a lot of volume for some athletes, especially the better athletes who are sweating a lot, because the sweat rates are basically proportional to work intensity. So your winners, the leaders of these races, might be sweating 1.5 liters per hour, 2 liters in some cases. There's no way you're going to be able to consume, 1.5 liters per hour of fluid and not experience gut issues. And some studies have actually tried doing this. They're like, okay, we're going to try and match this person's sweat rate. They're going to drink over 1 liter per hour of fluid, and predictably these people have gut issues because it's just a huge volume. So you don't want to go overboard either. There's this kind of in-between spot that's going to vary depending on the person, the event, the exercise session, and the environmental conditions. So what I would recommend is if you want to take more of a regimented approach and you don't want to rely just on your thirst, is to start going out, maybe once or twice a month in different environmental conditions at different intensities to see approximately what is your sweat rate, to get at least a ballpark figure. Now, to do that, just do like an hour at that intensity in that environment, weigh yourself before and afterwards, and you can figure out your sweat rate. There are some variables to consider with that calculation. You can find that stuff online. It's in my book. But you generally kind of want to see how much weight are you losing, because the weight you're losing in an hour of exercise is almost exclusively coming from fluid loss. So if you can figure out your sweat rate in different environments, that at least gives you some sort of gauge that allows you to make informed decisions about how much you want to hydrate, given these considerations. If I'm exercising at this pace, if it's this hot out, if it's this humid, I would expect myself to sweat about this much. And you don't want to go over that amount. You don't want to overhydrate. You might want to replace something like 1/2 to 2/3 if you can. Do it tolerably.
And I think that's great. 1/2 to 2/3. It's a misnomer that we need to replace everything. It's just impractical and can lead to issues.
Especially during ultra exercise, like if you get beyond 5, 6, 7 hours, you're going to actually lose some body mass from the burning of fuel. So there is an obligatory loss of mass the longer the exercise goes. So you should expect some ultra runners to have some level of weight loss after they've done, probably a 10-hour race. Now, it's going to vary depending on how much food they ate, some other things, but, it's pretty rare to expect an ultra athlete to just maintain their weight and have no weight loss over the course of a 10, 12-hour race. That would probably be, in some sense, overhydrating if they're consuming so much fluid that they lose no weight whatsoever.
And we've all, I think most of us have heard of the risks of hyponatremia with that overhydration status. Patrick, 2 final little frontiers here that you've done a beautiful book expanding on in full, done a beautiful job expanding in full with your book, training the gut, this concept of training the gut and then psychology in the athlete's gut. So training the gut, it makes sense, right? The gut can be trained. It's an organ, 30-foot passage as you've noted. So can you just share a little around this trainability of the gut and what can we practically do?
Yeah, I don't think you're going to see any montages like a Rocky, montage of training the gut anytime soon, like was it Rocky 4 where he fights Ivan Drago and they're in the woods doing the run through the snow and everything else. I don't think you're going to see that with eating anytime soon. But yeah, the gut is an adaptable organ. We know this anecdotally from competitive eaters. I think they still had the 4th of July eating contest this year. I think Joey Chestnut broke the record again. It's like 75 hot dogs.
Oh, my gosh.
And that's with the buns.
Oh, my gosh.
A crazy amount of food.
Oh.
So we know just anecdotally, even without doing studies, that you can train yourself to handle a large volume of food. Now, the question is, does that translate to any benefits to performance? That's more of an open question. What I would say is, if you are the person who wants to really push the boundaries of how much fuel you're going to take on during a race, then yes, you definitely need to spend some time training your guts to handle those specific foods and volume rates that you intend to ingest. So the interesting thing is that some of these adaptations may be just kind of general, like you just get comfortable with larger volumes of stuff in your stomach, so it might just be an overall perceptual benefit. And then there are probably some nutrient-specific adaptations. So if you want to make sure that the carbohydrate you're digesting and absorbing is done so as rapidly as possible, then you need to train with those specific fuels and foods to make that happen. And we have pretty good evidence now that there are some nutrient-specific adaptations that occur in the gut. Like if you habitually consume more carbohydrate in your diet, emptying of carbohydrate from the stomach tends to speed up over time. You may also get more of the transporters in your intestinal wall that help absorb those carbohydrates. Now, it's not like a crazy dramatic change in the adaptations, but there are some modest changes that occur based on your habitual diet and what you're doing during training sessions.
So that old adage of don't save it for the race day to test it is, it holds true in this sense.
Yes, especially if you're going to be the person who is eating, 60 to 90 or plus grams of carbohydrate per hour, then you almost undoubtedly have to, experiment with that quite a bit before you decide to do it during a race. Now, one interesting question is, do you have to do this during your training sessions, or can you just kind of do it even at rest to some degree? Can you kind of train your gut to handle those feeding rates? Because one concern is if you're doing this during a lot of your training sessions, you're almost like devoting a big bulk of your training just to kind of training your gut. The studies that have done this, they took like 2 weeks. They did 6 or 7 sessions where they ran for an hour, and every single one of those sessions they ingested 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour. So kind of just specifically focusing on, for a 2-week period, training the gut. I mean, that's a lot of time and energy to devote to that process. So one interesting question that's yet unanswered is, how many of these adaptations can you just get from changing your habitual diet and doing things outside of your actual physical training? And that's an unanswered question at this point. So maybe we'll have some answers to that in the near future.
Patrick, the effect of stress on the gut, just very briefly, what do you think is important to know around that? I think we all intuitively know we've been nervous, whether it's for an exam or for an event, for an important meeting, bad news. What do we need to know there?
So when you get stressed acutely, when you have anxiety, your body's going to respond. One of the major things that's going to happen is it's going to release a hormone, corticotropin releasing factor from your brain. And that sort of starts this cascade of things that occurs, modifies the activity of your autonomic nervous system, so the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of that nervous system. And those things have an effect on gastrointestinal function. So just very basically what happens in the upper half of the gut tends to be plugging things up or slowing it down. So emptying from the stomach slows down, which is generally not great during exercise if you want to have a efficient digestion and absorption of the things that you're eating. Now, your stomach needs to regulate things, but you don't want it so slowed down that it just kind of sits there like a brick. Now, in the lower half of the gut, it can speed things up, which a lot of runners and athletes have experience with when they're anxious before a race. Going to the Porta-John, standing in line, things just kind of seem to run through you because you're anxious. And that's been documented in a lot of different situations, including, war and other studies where they put people through extreme stressors. So it's going to be proportional to how probably stressed and anxious you are. Not everybody's going to experience those issues, but there's going to be a subset of athletes who do. So I think it's a little bit of an underappreciated cause of gastrointestinal issues in athletes, at least from the scientific perspective. There's only been a handful of studies that have looked at these things in athletes. I've published a couple of these in the last few years. And my studies do seem to confirm that the amount of stress and anxiety that people are reporting do correlate with more GI problems, not only during their regular life, but also during exercise. So practically speaking, I think if athletes who are experiencing a lot of stress and anxiety can somehow get a handle on that a little bit, it may translate over into less gut problems during exercise. In theory, we don't have studies to confirm that. Probably be doing some of those in the next couple of years, but intuitively, it makes sense that that's going to be true. So we'll see what happens with that.
Yeah, that's great. Very practical. I think we'd all acknowledge, and we've experienced that. Patrick, before I ask you one of the set questions that every guest gets asked, and that's for one piece of advice, just briefly, what would be the top 3 mistakes that you see athletes making with their gut?
I think one would be using gut-provoking medications like non-steroidal and anti-inflammatory drugs, so whether it be ibuprofen or naproxen, Aleve, Advil, especially in close proximity to exercise. We know that causes the gut to become a little bit more leaky. So you see what are called endotoxins appearing in the blood at a higher rate. They're kind of parts of bacteria that are sort of an indicator that the defensive wall that your gut barrier serves is becoming a little bit impaired. We also see rates of cramping and gastrointestinal problems higher among athletes who tend to use those types of medications during competition. So I'm not saying don't use any, but be careful about the amount and the timing. If you can get away with not using them, I would say don't use them. And especially avoid high dosages in proximity to vigorous exercise and competition. So, some athletes are aware of that issue and some aren't. So I would say that that's a mistake that some athletes are still making, potentially. Another one would be practicing your feeling. I mean, that's a tried and true recommendation that pretty much every nutritionist and dietitian will say is don't wait until competition to do this stuff. You need to really be a little bit more regimented about it, a little bit more scientific about it, and at least trial it out a few times before you get into competition. So, I mean, even if you're someone who's not, front of the pack and you're more middle of the pack, you probably want an experience that's going to be positive, and you don't want to have GI issues ruining your race or your experience. So, yeah, definitely testing those things out beforehand. One other one might be, I guess, I don't know if this is a top 3, but it's one just thinking of that we haven't talked a lot about is acclimatizing to the heat. It's July right now. It's super hot where I am. I don't know what it's like down in Australia. Is this your winter?
Correct, yeah.
What's the temperature like down there now?
Well, I'm in Queensland, the promised land, so it's quite temperate, Patrick. It's probably 10 degrees at a low. Sorry about the metrics.
Yeah.
And 25 degrees through the day. It's pretty temperate.
We're kind of hovering this is in Fahrenheit, again, the conversion factor, 105 to 110 heat index here, so it's warm.
It's warm,
And athletes, if they're going to be competing in heat, they need to make sure to acclimatize not only for their performance and for reducing the risk of things like heat illnesses, but probably to minimize gut issues as well. Consistently, we see if you put people in a heat chamber and ask them to exercise in comparison to the same intensity in a temperate environment, gut problems are a lot more common in the heat. So if an athlete is not acclimatized, it's going to be much more likely they're going to experience problems. So, I mean, not only, again, for performance reasons and for the risk of heat illnesses, but to make sure that your gut functions appropriately, is you want to make sure to acclimatize to that hot environment.
So, top 3 mistakes, using gut-provoking medications, practicing your... I can't remember. See what I've written down here. Practicing your fueling, making sure you practice, and 3, acclimatizing to the heat. And then, Patrick, if you could boil everything you've learned through your extensive career as a clinician, as a scientist, in all the various capacities you've had to date through your impressive career, into one piece of advice to help the listener of this show perform at their physical best, what would Dr. Patrick Wilson's single piece of advice be?
It's a lot of pressure. I would say you need to be meticulous about, if you want to fix these problems, it'd be good to start documenting regularly when you experience them, how severe they are, what the exact problems are, and what are the situational factors around that time that could be provoking those issues. So gut problems are really hard to figure out sometimes because there can be a lot of potential causes. I mean, go into a family physician office and the number of people walking through the door who have gut problems is pretty dang high. It can be from stress, lack of sleep, diet. So to get some sense of maybe where some of this stuff is coming from, I think at least occasionally logging and recording what problems you're having, what specific symptoms, and thinking through what are some of the things that are going on in my life. What am I doing for my diet? Have I changed something? Medications, to see if you can identify some of those trigger issues. It's tough. Honestly, that's, to be blunt, they're not easy problems in some cases to solve. So I think having some record of what's going on can at least give you a better chance at getting a handle on some of those issues.
So documenting the issues or making an attempt to do that, that's terrific. Patrick, before you're not out of the pressure cooker just yet, every guest issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. So what is Dr. Patrick Wilson's physical challenge going to be? Physical challenge, that's interesting. I'd maybe go down and eat 15 hot dogs in 10 minutes. No, I guess physical challenge, one would be maybe try on your next run if you have some gut problems, if you have some more anxiety in your life or stress, give a shot at doing some slow, deep breathing for 5 or 10 minutes within the half hour beforehand and see whether or not that helps with any of your gut issues. And again, this is particularly for those athletes who have more of that stress and anxiety in their life. For those that don't, I don't know that it would be particularly helpful for that issue, but there's little harm, and it's one of the few interventions you can kind of think of that doesn't have a lot of downsides, that has potentially quite a bit of upsides, not only for the gut, but for your mental health and other stuff. So, I think that's an easy one. That's a physical challenge that they can give a try before one of their next runs. That's brilliant. It ties in very nicely, Patrick, with a former featured guest, Expert Edition James Fletcher, who shared around the science of the breath and the role that it can have on anxiety. And he shared a technique called the exhalation pause, breathing out and then counting before you then inhale again. So, and trying to lengthen out that interval with the number of breaths. Patrick Wilson, this has been a huge contribution you've made to the field for the beginner athlete, the committed, the health professional. I would encourage every single practitioner out there, an athlete, to get a copy of this book. It's a well put together document. It's fun, as we've had some lighthearted references to tonight, but you've really done the heavy lifting on what is really, let's be fair, a fairly unsexy topic, but one that bothers everyone. So well done. Well, I appreciate that, and I really appreciate the invite on the show, Brad. It's been nice talking about this. It's always an enjoyable conversation. Like you said, it's not always the sexiest topic in the world, but somebody's got to talk about it, right? And it's so practical, and it's so far and wide-reaching. And Patrick, for the listener that wants to follow along with your outputs, your scientific work, you've authored over 45 scientific papers to date. What's the best way to follow you? On Twitter, probably, and I'm probably going to butcher my handle again. It's at sportsrd_PhD, I believe. Correct. I've got it in front of me. So at sports, capital RD_PhD. And it's one of the more unique handles I've seen. So, thank you for the confirmation there. I've been asked that a number of times, and every time I'm unprepared for it. You think I'd learn at some point. Patrick Wilson, thank you for your contribution to the Physical Performance Show. Thanks, Brad. So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust and I know you enjoyed today's sharings via Patrick Wilson. You'll find Patrick over on Twitter at sportsrd_PhD, or visit the Athlete's Gut website. If you're yet to pick up a copy, it is a must-have resource for your bookshelf as an endurance athlete, coach, or practitioner. Big thanks, as always, to the great folk who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, audio engineering, Susan Wilkin, show administration, Matthew Olding, graphic design, and Milan Borrow, videography. If you're yet to follow the Physical Performance Show over on YouTube, there you can now enjoy video of each episode. So do jump over and hit subscribe. Keep the podsies coming, team. They are episodes that you are enjoying. Take a screenshot, post it to social, and tag the show in at Physical Performance Show. We'll reshare those, and they are a whole lot of fun to see coming through. Massive thanks to our patrons of the show for your support. Podcasts, while they're free to enjoy, they are not free to produce, so our patrons really make the show possible. Now, if you'd like to become a patron of the show, you can do so from just $5 per month. Simply jump over to Patreon, search for the Physical Performance Show, and there you can pledge your support. Now, in return, we'll give you complimentary access to our back catalogue of live stream events and all upcoming live stream events. Just recently, we featured positive sports psychology researcher Rory Darkins, who shared a wonderful session around cultivating deep well-being. That's now available for purchase for our non-patrons for $49, including PDF copies of the notes and ongoing access to the recording. But for our patrons, that's there available now complimentary. So jump over to physicalperformanceshow.com/events. Now, coming up on the Physical Performance Show, we have some important expert editions coming your way. For one, we'll be exploring cardiac health of the endurance athlete with Dr. Jessica Orchard. Jessica will share around the effects of endurance training on the heart, common cardiac issues for endurance athletes, when to get a cardiac screening, alongside a discussion of cardiac risk factors. So be sure to be tuning in next week to the Physical Performance Show. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.